I always thought I was careful in the woods. I had been hiking for years since I was a teenager, and I never took dumb risks. I checked the weather, packed more food than I needed, carried extra water, a good knife, and a basic first aid kit. I never pushed myself past my limits, and I always stuck to the marked trails. That last part was important. People who wandered off trail were the ones who got lost, injured, or worse. I didn't want to be one of those people. But sometimes all it takes is one small mistake. This trip was supposed to be simple. Just 2 days alone in the mountains, a solo getaway to clear my head. I had picked a trail in a national forest, a 12-mile loop that climbed up through thick pine forest before opening up into alpine meadows, with a campsite near a lake at the highest point. The plan was to hike in, camp for a night, then take the loop back down the next morning. Nothing crazy. I set out early in the morning, my pack snug against my back, my boots solid on the dirt path. The first few miles were peaceful, the forest quiet except for the occasional rustle of squirrels in the underbrush. The air was cool, fresh with the scent of pine and damp earth. I fell into a rhythm, my boots crunching against the packed dirt, my breathing steady. It was around mile 5 when I saw the side trail. It wasn't on my map. It wasn't marked. Just a thin path, barely wide enough for a single person, breaking off from the main trail and winding into the trees. It looked well-trodden, too clear to be an animal trail, but not maintained like the official paths. I stopped, frowning at it. I should have kept walking. Instead, I pulled out my map, double-checking the area. Nothing. No official trails, no old logging roads. Just solid forest. But the trail was there, and it looked recent, like people had been using it. I hesitated. I wasn't the kind of person who went off-trail, but something about it bothered me. If it was an unofficial path, where did it go? A shortcut? A dead end? My curiosity got the better of me. I stepped off the main trail and onto the narrow path. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The deeper I walked, the more the sounds of the forest seemed to disappear. No wind, no birds, just my footsteps. The path itself twisted through the trees, curving unnaturally, like it was made to disorient someone. I kept going, my stomach tightening for no good reason. 15 minutes passed, then 30. I should have turned around, but I didn't. That was my second mistake. The trail sloped downward, the trees growing closer together, the branches hanging low. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the further I went, the more uneasy I felt. The air smelled different, like damp rot. The dirt beneath my boots turned soft, almost muddy. My instincts screamed at me to go back, but I had that hiker's stubbornness. I had already come this far. Might as well see where it led. Then I found the cabin. It was old, too old. The wood was dark with age, the roof sagging, the door hanging open just a little. No signs of recent activity, no footprints, no tire tracks, no fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, maybe longer. Something was wrong with it. I could feel it. I don't know why I stepped closer. Maybe I wanted to see if anyone had been there recently. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. The air felt thick, humid. I could hear my own breathing, too loud in my ears. The door creaked when I pushed it. Inside, it was worse. The first thing I saw was the chair. Just a single wooden chair, sitting in the center of the room. Nothing else, no furniture, no bed, no stove. Just that chair. And the walls. The walls had scratches on them. Hundreds of them. Deep, uneven gouges, like someone had raked their fingernails across the wood over and over. Some marks were old, faded with time. Others looked fresh. Something moved behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. But there was nothing there. Just the trees outside, swaying slightly. The light was dim, like the sun had suddenly dipped lower in the sky. I needed to leave. Now, I backed out of the cabin, my pulse hammering. I turned, ready to follow the path back to the main trail. But it wasn't there. The trail was gone. I spun in circles, searching for it. I had just walked in from that direction. There should have been a clear path. But all I saw were trees. Thick, dark trees, pressing closer than before. My breath came in quick, uneven gasps. I wasn't stupid. I knew panic would make things worse. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I had a compass. I had my map. I could get back to the main trail if I stayed calm. I turned west, the direction I had come from. I pushed through the trees, branches scraping against my arms, my legs. I walked for 10 minutes, then 20. Then I saw the cabin again. I stopped dead. My brain refused to understand what I was seeing. I had walked away from it. I had been going in a straight line. And yet there it was. The same sagging roof. The same open door. The same chair, sitting in the middle of the room. I turned and ran. I didn't care about the direction anymore. I just ran, crashing through the underbrush, my breath ragged. I tripped, hit the ground hard, scrambled up, kept going. Then suddenly the trees thinned. I stumbled onto solid ground. The real trail, the marked, official trail. I stood there, gasping, looking around. The sun was higher than before, the air cooler, normal, the way it should be. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I hiked out of there, faster than I ever had in my life, barely stopping until I reached my car. I never found that trail again. I checked maps, asked other hikers. No one knew about it. No one had ever seen an old cabin in those woods. But I know what I saw, and I know that if I had stayed any longer, I wouldn't have made it back. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself stranded, miles from the nearest road with no clear way back. I had planned a 2-day trip through a national forest, a loop trail that climbed a ridge, offering a long stretch of exposed rock before descending back into dense pine forest. The route was well documented, moderate in difficulty, and heavily used in summer. But I had come in the early fall, just after the peak season, when the air was crisp and the crowds were gone. I parked at the trailhead before sunrise, checked my gear, and started up the path. The first few miles were easy, wide dirt trails, gradual incline, the sound of distant birds in the trees. I fell into my usual hiking rhythm, my boots pressing into damp soil, the weight of my pack settling comfortably on my shoulders. The trail climbed steadily, the trees thinning as I gained elevation. After about 4 hours, I reached the ridge, a long, narrow stretch of exposed rock, sloping gently upward. I took a break, sitting on a boulder, drinking from my water bottle. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the sharp scent of pine and cold stone. I looked ahead. The trail followed the ridge for another few miles before dropping into a valley, where I planned to camp for the night. I kept walking. The path was easy to follow at first, marked by small cairns, stacks of rocks left by other hikers. But as I moved further along the ridge, the markers became less frequent. I didn't think much of it at the time. The terrain was open with good visibility, and I could see where the trail should be leading. Then the wind shifted. A low, heavy gust swept across the ridge, colder than before. The sky had darkened. Not storm clouds, but a dull, flat gray. I stopped, checking my map. The terrain didn't match what I expected. The ridge seemed narrower than it should have been, the drop-off steeper. I turned back the way I came, and nothing looked familiar. The cairns were gone. The boulders I had passed earlier weren't there. It was just open rock, sloping downward on both sides, with no clear path. My pulse picked up. I wasn't lost. Not yet. I had a compass. I had my map. I had daylight. I moved carefully, picking my way back toward where I thought I had come from. But the terrain kept shifting. Small ridges and dips that hadn't been there before. I checked my map again, trying to orient myself. If I kept heading west, I would eventually hit the tree line, and from there I could find the trail again. I walked for over an hour. The trees never came. The landscape stretched endlessly in front of me. Barren rock, empty ridges. My legs ached from the uneven ground. My throat was dry, despite my water. Then I saw something ahead. First, I thought it was another cairn. A small stack of stones, slightly off balance. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a cairn at all. It was a pile of bones, not animal bones. My stomach clenched. I knelt, staring at them. The bones were old, yellowed, weathered by wind and rain. Some had been cracked as if by pressure. They were arranged in a rough circle, like someone had placed them there deliberately. I stood up, my breath coming fast. I turned, and I saw more, scattered across the rock in irregular intervals, small piles of bones, some barely visible under thin layers of dirt.
A femur, a shattered skull, a ribcage collapsed inward.
I backed away, my pulse hammering. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just someone who had gotten lost. This was something else. I turned sharply and kept moving. The wind had died completely. The air felt thick, heavy. My own footsteps sounded wrong against the rock. Too loud, too sharp. I needed to get off this ridge. I kept my pace steady, forcing myself not to run. I moved downhill, hoping to find a slope that would lead me back to the trees. But the ground kept tilting in ways that didn't make sense. Angles that felt wrong, dips that should have been climbs. Then I saw the cave. A narrow opening, barely visible in the rock face, partially hidden by a ledge. I hesitated. Every part of me screamed not to go near it. But I needed shelter. I needed a place to stop, to think. I stepped inside. The air was colder, damp. The space wasn't deep, just a small hollow in the rock, barely tall enough for me to stand. But the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, uneven gouges, overlapping each other in chaotic patterns. I stepped closer, running my fingers over them. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a frantic repetition of shapes. Tallies, hundreds of them carved deep into the stone. I stumbled back, my breath quickening. I turned to leave, and outside the cave, less than 50 feet away, something moved. It was low to the ground, barely more than a shadow against the rock. Crawling, moving with deliberate, jerky motions. I didn't stop to look. I ran. I scrambled down the ridge, slipping on loose stone, my pack throwing me off balance. My knees hit the ground hard, pain jolting up my legs. I pushed forward, breath burning in my chest. The landscape blurred, rocks, dips, uneven ground. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Then trees. The moment I saw them, I sprinted. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping against my arms. My boots slammed into soft dirt. I kept going, running until my lungs felt like they would split. Then I collapsed. I lay there, gasping, my body shaking. The forest was silent, normal. I pulled out my map, my compass. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely hold them. But I wasn't lost anymore. I could find my way back. I walked for hours, refusing to stop. By the time I reached my car, the sun was setting. I threw my pack inside, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't look back. I never reported what I found. I never told anyone about the bones, the scratches, the thing I saw, because I knew no one would believe me, and because I knew, somewhere out there, in the empty stretches of rock, in the places where the trail disappears, there are things you aren't supposed to find. And once you do, they don't let you go. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself stranded, miles from the nearest road with no clear way back. I had planned a 4-day trip through a remote canyon in the desert, a place I had read about in an old hiking book. It wasn't a marked trail, just a narrow wash that wound through high sandstone cliffs, eventually leading to a dry riverbed. From there, I could follow the riverbed downstream to where it met a well-known trail, loop back around, and return to my car. I had mapped everything carefully. I packed enough food, extra water, a satellite GPS, and a printed topo map as a backup. I checked the weather, no rain in the forecast, no flash flood risk. It was supposed to be an easy, quiet trip, just me and the desert. I started before sunrise, my car parked at a dusty pull-off along a dirt road. The air was cool, the sand underfoot still cold from the night. I followed a faint footpath down into the canyon, my boots crunching against loose rock. By midday, the canyon walls had risen high around me. Smooth, towering cliffs of red rock, curving in unnatural shapes from thousands of years of wind and water. The air was still heavy with heat. I had expected that. The desert was always silent. The only sounds my own footsteps, the occasional flutter of a bird taking off from a rock ledge. I made good time, following the wash deeper into the canyon. The walls narrowed in places, pressing close, the sky a thin strip of blue above. I stopped to rest in the shade of an overhang, drinking from my water bottle. I checked my GPS. Everything looked right. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I reached the dry riverbed, a wide stretch of cracked earth and scattered stones, leading west. I followed it, my shadow stretching long behind me. The air smelled like dust and sun-baked rock. I planned to make camp soon, find a flat spot, set up my tent, eat, and sleep. That's when I saw the footprints. They were ahead of me in the dry riverbed, deep impressions in the sand, leading in the same direction I was heading. They weren't mine. I stopped, my pulse picking up. The prints were fresh, sharp edges, undisturbed by wind. I hadn't seen another person all day. No cars at the pull-off, no tire tracks on the dirt road. And these weren't boot prints. They were barefoot. I felt a slow unease creep into my chest. I crouched, looking closer. The prints were strange. Too long, the toes oddly spaced. They trailed ahead, vanishing around a bend in the canyon. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe someone had walked barefoot out here recently. Maybe I just hadn't seen them. It didn't mean anything. I kept walking, but I felt different now. The canyon felt different. The silence seemed heavier. The sun was lower, the shadows stretching further across the rock. I found a place to camp near a boulder, a flat patch of sand protected from the wind. I set up my tent, boiled water for a dehydrated meal, ate quickly. The footprints were still in my mind. I told myself it was fine, just an old print, a trick of erosion. I zipped myself into my tent as the last light faded. I lay there listening to the desert. It was too quiet. Normally, there were at least small noises, wind shifting sand, the distant cry of a coyote. But there was nothing, just silence pressing in from all sides. Then, sometime in the middle of the night, I heard it. A sound, a soft, shuffling scrape, very close. I held my breath, my fingers tightening around my sleeping bag. Another scrape, slow, deliberate, right outside my tent. I didn't move. The fabric of the tent shifted slightly, as if something had brushed against it. My mouth was dry. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my skull. I lay like that for what felt like forever, barely breathing. Then nothing. The sound stopped. The air was still again. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, my knife gripped tight in one hand, my other hand near my headlamp. As soon as the first gray light touched the canyon walls, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The sand around my campsite was covered in footprints. Not boot prints. The same long, barefoot tracks I had seen before, circling my tent. I packed fast. I didn't eat. I didn't waste time. I shoved everything into my pack and started moving. I didn't run. Running was panic. Running was a good way to get hurt. I just walked fast, heart hammering, every muscle in my body tight. The footprints followed the riverbed ahead of me. I ignored them. I kept my eyes forward. I walked for hours, my legs aching, sweat soaking my shirt. The canyon walls slowly opened up, the cliffs lowering, the sky widening. I knew I was getting close to where the riverbed met the main trail. Then, ahead of me, something moved, a flicker of motion near a rock outcrop. I stopped. There was nothing there, just empty desert. I swallowed hard and kept walking. The next time I saw movement, it was closer, a shadow shifting behind a boulder. I didn't stop this time. I walked faster. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Not an echo. Not the sound of my own boots. Someone else. Walking behind me. I didn't turn around. I didn't look. I just kept moving, my breath coming fast, my hands sweating against my trekking poles. The footsteps kept pace with me. Close. Too close. I reached the junction where the dry riverbed met the main trail. A clear, marked path leading back to civilization. I nearly broke into a run. I hiked the last 5 miles without stopping. When I finally saw my car, sitting alone on the dirt road, I almost collapsed. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced back. At the edge of the trail, just before it disappeared into the canyon, something stood there, too far away to see clearly. Tall, motionless, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I hit pavement, until I saw other cars, until I was far, far away from that canyon. I don't know what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there with me, but I know one thing for sure. I was not alone in that canyon. I had been hiking alone for years, always careful, always prepared. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take unnecessary risks. But none of that mattered when I found myself lost in the deep woods, miles from the nearest road, with no clear way back. I had planned a 3-day solo backpacking trip through a stretch of national forest that wasn't well-traveled. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for days. That was exactly what I wanted. Quiet, solitude, a break from everything. The forest was old growth, dense with towering pines and thick underbrush. The trail I planned to take was unmarked, but I had mapped it out carefully beforehand. I had a GPS, a topographic map, and a compass. I wasn't worried. I parked at the trailhead in the early morning, locked my car, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, soft dirt trails, scattered patches of sunlight breaking through the canopy, birds chattering in the distance. The air smelled like pine and damp earth. I moved steadily, covering ground fast. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. After a few hours, the only sounds were my own footsteps and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. By midday, I reached the first waypoint, a small clearing with a stream running through it. I stopped, refilled my water, ate a quick meal, and checked my map. Everything was going exactly as planned. I kept moving. As the day stretched on, the terrain grew more rugged. The trees pressed in closer. The underbrush thickened. The light took on that golden hue that meant evening wasn't far off. I needed to find a place to camp. I found a small, flat spot near the base of a hill, a good distance from the stream but not too far. The ground was firm. No signs of animal tracks. It was a good spot. I set up my tent, ate, and sat for a while, just listening to the sounds of the forest. Then I noticed something strange. The woods were silent. Not just quiet, silent.
No birds.
No wind. No distant rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush. Just stillness. Put me on edge. I told myself it was nothing. I was just overthinking it. I climbed into my tent, zipped it up, and lay in my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep well. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. A sound had pulled me from sleep. A rustling. Not the wind. Something moving through the underbrush. Slow. Deliberate. Close. I stayed completely still, listening. My heart was pounding. The sound stopped. I strained my ears, but the silence had returned. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there, my knife close, waiting for the first light of dawn. As soon as the sky started turning gray, I got up, packed my gear, and started moving. I wasn't supposed to leave the forest until the third day, but I decided I didn't want to spend another night out here. I would cut my trip short, follow the planned route, and be back at my car by evening. But something was wrong. The landscape didn't look right. I checked my map, checked my GPS. The numbers were off. The compass needle spun strangely, refusing to settle. I should have been moving east, following a gradual slope downward. Instead, the terrain kept rising, the trees pressing in closer. I kept walking. Hours passed. Nothing looked familiar. I stopped to rest, drinking from my water bottle, trying to steady my nerves. I wasn't lost. Couldn't be lost. I had my tools, but nothing made sense. Then I saw something ahead. First, I thought it was just another tree, but as I got closer, I realized it was wrong. A structure. Wooden. Rough. A small, half-collapsed cabin, hidden among the trees. It didn't make sense. There was no record of any structures out here. I had studied the maps. I should have turned around, but I didn't. I stepped closer. The wood was old, weathered, the door hanging open. The ground around it was disturbed. Patches of dirt scuffed as if something had been dragged. I took another step. Then I saw the footprints. Not mine. Deep impressions in the dirt. Barefoot. Too long. The toes spread strangely apart. I backed away, my pulse hammering. I turned and started walking fast, my breath coming short. Then I heard it. A sound behind me. Soft. Almost careful. Footsteps. Following me. I didn't turn around. I walked faster. The trees blurred. My legs burned. My breath was loud in my ears. The sound behind me didn't stop. Kept pace. Closer. Too close. I ran. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just ran. Branches tore at my arms. My pack slammed against my back. My boots slipped on loose dirt. Then sunlight. I burst from the trees onto a dirt road. My car was there. I didn't stop. I yanked the door open, threw myself inside, locked the doors, started the engine with shaking hands. As I pulled onto the road, I glanced into the rearview mirror. At the edge of the tree line, just before it disappeared into the shadows, something stood there, tall, still, watching. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I drove until I saw other cars, until I was far away from those woods. I don't know what I saw. I don't know how I got so turned around. But I know one thing for sure. I was not alone in that forest. Hiking had always been something I did to clear my head. I wasn't reckless, but I enjoyed pushing myself, going deep into the wilderness, where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the appeal, the quiet, the solitude. This trip was supposed to be just another one of those. A 3-day solo hike through a remote canyon in the desert. No marked trails, no crowds, just me and the open landscape. I had planned every detail. I had studied the maps, packed extra water, brought my GPS and a paper map as backup. I wasn't expecting to get lost. I wasn't expecting to find something that shouldn't have been there. Day 1, I parked at the trailhead early in the morning, stepping out into the cool desert air. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the rocky terrain. I strapped on my pack, adjusted my gear, and set out. The first few miles were easy, the ground mostly flat, dotted with low shrubs and dry riverbeds. The canyon walls rose in the distance, towering cliffs of red rock, cut deep by centuries of wind and water. That was my destination. By midday, I had descended into the canyon. The air was hotter down there, the walls rising high on either side, blocking most of the wind. It was quiet, the only sounds my own footsteps and the occasional bird echoing off the rock. I followed a dry streambed, navigating around boulders and patches of loose sand. The plan was to hike deep into the canyon, find a good place to camp, and then explore some of the side passages the next day. Everything was going as planned, until I found the footprints. They were faint, half covered by sand, but they were there, barefoot, and they weren't human. The shape was wrong, long, too narrow, the toes splayed in a strange way. I crouched down, running my fingers over the edges. Fresh. Within the last day or two, I glanced up, scanning the canyon around me. Nothing, just rock and silence. I kept moving. By late afternoon, I had found a decent spot to camp. Flat ground, some natural cover from the wind. I set up my tent, ate a quick meal, and sat with my back against a boulder, watching the light fade. The silence felt different now, heavier. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, convinced I had heard something outside my tent, a shifting of sand, a soft, deliberate movement. But every time I listened, there was nothing, just silence. Day 2, I woke up early, feeling uneasy but determined to finish what I had planned. I left most of my gear at camp and set out to explore one of the side canyons. It was narrower than the main path, winding through high walls of rock, the sky barely visible overhead. An hour in, I found something strange, a structure. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw it wasn't natural. A rough shelter, built against the canyon wall. Small, maybe 5 feet tall, made from stacked stones and dried mud. It didn't look old. Someone had built this recently. I stepped closer, my pulse picking up. The entrance was low, just a dark opening in the rock. I hesitated. Then I noticed something near the entrance. Pile of bones, picked clean, sun-bleached. Some were animal, small skulls, ribs, but some were bigger, too big. I turned and left, moving fast. I didn't run, not yet, but I didn't stop. By the time I reached camp, the sun was sinking. I packed my things, my hands moving quickly. I wasn't staying another night. I started hiking back, pushing myself hard. I could make it to the canyon entrance by morning. Then I heard it, a sound behind me, soft, footsteps in the sand. I didn't turn around. I kept moving, faster. The sound kept pace. Then I smelled it. Rot, thick and sour. I walked faster, my breath coming short. My heart was hammering. Then up ahead something moved, a shape stepping out from behind a boulder. Tall, thin, watching. I didn't think. I ran. I didn't stop. Not when I tripped, not when my legs burned, not when the canyon walls seemed to press in around me. I ran until the sun rose, until I saw my truck in the distance, until I was safe. I don't know what I saw in that canyon. I don't ever want to find out. I had been planning this hike for months. Ever since I saw a post about the remote backcountry trails in Montana, I knew I had to go. The pictures showed vast, untouched wilderness, dense forests, jagged peaks, and long, winding rivers cutting through the valleys. It looked perfect, the kind of place you could go for days without seeing another person. That was exactly what I wanted. No cell service, no noise, no people. Just me, my pack, and the trail. I picked a route that wasn't well traveled. It was about 30 miles out and back, cutting through thick pine forests, over high ridges and past deep, isolated lakes. The elevation gain was brutal, but I was ready for it. I had all my gear, tent, sleeping bag, bear spray, enough food for 5 days. Everything was set. I drove out early, the sun barely up, the roads empty. By the time I reached the trailhead, there was only one other car in the lot, an old truck with faded paint and mud caked on the tires. I didn't think much of it. Probably another hiker already out on the trail. I checked my pack one last time, tightened the straps, and started walking. The first few miles were easy, just a slow climb through dense forest. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. The trail was narrow, winding between massive trees, the ground soft with fallen needles. Birds called from the branches, and now and then, I'd hear the rustle of something moving in the undergrowth. A squirrel, maybe a deer. After about an hour, I reached the first real climb. The trail turned steep, the dirt loose beneath my boots. I leaned forward, using my trekking poles to push myself up. My breathing grew heavy, sweat starting to build under my pack. I stopped once to take a sip of water, looking back down at the forest below. The trees stretched out endlessly, dark green and unbroken. No roads, no buildings, just wilderness. I kept moving. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing at the top of a ridge. It was the perfect place to rest. Flat ground, a clear view of the valley below. I dropped my pack and sat down, stretching out my legs. I took a deep breath, enjoying the silence. That's when I noticed something. At the far end of the clearing, near the treeline, was an old fire ring. Just a circle of blackened stones, half covered in dirt and moss. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. But next to it, half buried in the grass, was something else. A boot. It was old, the leather cracked and faded, the laces missing. I walked over and picked it up. Inside, the insole was worn down to nothing, the toe caked with dried mud. Someone had left it here a long time ago. I looked around, but there was nothing else. No pack, no other gear, just the boot. I tossed it back down and headed out. The trail dropped steeply after that, winding down into a deep valley. The trees grew thicker, the air damp and cool. I passed a stream, the water clear and fast-moving, then started the next climb. It was slow going, my legs already tired, but I pushed through. I wanted to reach the lake before dark. It was just after 6 when I finally saw the water through the trees. The lake was small, maybe 100 yards across, surrounded by thick forest. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting the sky. I found a flat patch of ground near the shore and set up my tent. After eating, I sat by the water, watching the last light fade behind the trees. The air was still, the forest silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just the occasional ripple on the water's surface. That's when I saw the footprints. They were faint, just a few depressions in the dirt near the water's edge. But they were fresh, too fresh. I stood up, my skin prickling. The prints were barefoot. Whoever left them hadn't been wearing shoes. And they weren't mine. I scanned the trees, but saw nothing. The forest was just a wall of darkness. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe an animal had come down for a drink. Maybe I was just seeing things. I went back to my tent, zipped myself in, and tried to sleep. I woke up sometime after midnight. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A sound, faint but unmistakable. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing. Just outside my tent. I lay completely still, my heart pounding. The sound was close. Too close. Then, after what felt like forever, it stopped. I stayed awake the rest of the night, listening. When morning finally came, I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The forest was empty.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But my bear spray was gone. I packed up fast. My whole body was on edge. Every rustle in the trees made me flinch. I needed to get out. I moved quickly, barely stopping for water. The whole way back, I felt it, that prickling sensation on my skin like I was being watched. When I finally reached the trailhead, my car was the only one there. But the old truck was gone. And nailed to a tree near the lot was something I hadn't seen before. A boot, the same one I had found on the ridge. I had been hiking alone for years. It wasn't about proving anything or chasing some big life-changing moment. I just liked the quiet. The world had gotten too crowded, too loud, too connected. Out there, in the deep woods, it was just me and the trail. No emails, no news, no traffic. Just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crunch of my boots on dirt. This trip was supposed to be like any other. A solo trek through a section of the Idaho wilderness that barely saw any foot traffic. I had planned a 5-day loop, about 40 miles through thick forest, across 2 mountain ridges, and down into a remote valley where a long, winding river cut through the landscape like a scar. It wasn't a marked trail, just an old hunter's route I had found on some outdated maps. That was part of the draw. Fewer people meant fewer problems. I packed light but smart: tent, sleeping bag, extra layers, a stove, enough food to last the trip. I had my Garmin with me, fully charged, and an old-fashioned compass as backup. Bear spray, a knife, a first aid kit. Everything I needed, nothing I didn't. I started early, just as the sun was coming up. The first few miles were easy, a gentle incline through a dense pine forest. The trees were tall and packed close together, their trunks dark with age. The trail was barely a trail at all, just a faint path in the dirt, almost swallowed by time. The air was crisp, cool, and filled with the scent of damp earth. By noon, I was deep in the woods, far from anything. The trees stretched in every direction, unbroken except for the occasional clearing where sunlight managed to slip through. I hadn't seen a single sign of another person. No footprints, no fire rings, no empty beer cans left behind. Felt like no one had been out here in years. That's when I found the first thing that didn't make sense. About 10 feet off the trail, half hidden in the underbrush, was a jacket. An old, faded green jacket, torn and crusted with dirt. I walked over and nudged it with my boot. The fabric was stiff, the color almost blending in with the forest floor. I hesitated. Then I picked it up. It smelled like earth and mildew, like it had been sitting out here for a long time. But the thing was, it hadn't rotted away. It was weathered, sure, but still intact. The kind of thing that hadn't been here for years, maybe months, maybe weeks. I looked around, scanning the trees. Nothing, just silence and endless forest. I dropped the jacket and kept moving. The trail grew steeper as I climbed toward the first ridge. The higher I got, the thinner the trees became, opening up glimpses of the land below. A sea of dark green stretching out forever, untouched and wild. I reached the top by late afternoon. It was the perfect place to set up camp, a flat clearing with a view of the valley below. I pitched my tent, made dinner, and sat on a fallen log, watching the last light slip behind the mountains. That's when I saw the second thing. About 50 yards from my camp, at the edge of the clearing, something was stuck in the branches of a low tree. It was small, dark, swaying slightly in the breeze. I stood up and walked over. It was a shoe, a single old hiking boot, dangling from a broken branch. I stared at it. The leather was cracked, the laces missing. It had been there a long time. I turned back toward my camp, my stomach tight. This was supposed to be an abandoned trail. No one had been out here in years. Then why did it feel like someone had? I barely slept that night. Every sound in the dark made my skin crawl. The wind through the trees, the shifting of branches, the distant call of some animal. I kept my knife close, my bear spray within reach. Nothing happened. At dawn, I packed up and kept moving. The trail dropped steeply into the valley, the ground uneven and littered with loose rocks. I took my time watching my footing. One bad step and I'd be stranded miles from help. By midday, I reached the river. It was wide, fast-moving, the water dark and cold. I found a shallow section and waded across, the icy current numbing my legs. I kept going, pushing deeper into the valley. The trees were thicker here, the undergrowth dense. The silence felt different, heavier. Then I saw it. In the middle of the trail, half covered in dirt, was a backpack. I stopped. It was old. The fabric faded, the straps frayed. A long tear ran down one side, spilling out a mess of soggy clothes and rusted gear. I crouched down and poked through it. A stove broken. A canteen empty. A map, the edges curled with moisture.
No wallet.
No ID. No sign of who it had belonged to. I looked around. The trees loomed overhead, thick and unyielding. I checked the ground.
No footprints.
No sign of an animal dragging it. It was just there. I stood up, my heartbeat slow and heavy. Something was wrong. I kept walking. The valley stretched on for miles, endless trees swallowing the sky. The trail twisted and turned, disappearing into the undergrowth. Then, in the late afternoon, I found the third thing, the tarp. It was draped over something, just off the trail. My hands felt cold as I walked toward it. I hesitated. Then I grabbed a corner and pulled. Underneath was a pile of bones. Animal bones. At least that's what I told myself at first. But as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. Some of them were too big. The tarp slipped from my fingers. I turned and walked away. Fast. I didn't stop. Not when my legs burned. Not when my breath came in ragged gasps. I hiked through the night, my flashlight cutting through the dark. Every rustle in the trees made my skin crawl. I felt it. Something watching, something just beyond the edges of the light. By dawn, I was halfway up the ridge, my body screaming for rest. I didn't care. I needed to get out. The second I had service, I hit the SOS on my Garmin. They found me by midday. A ranger, young and confused, asked if I was hurt. I told him no. I didn't tell him about the jacket. I didn't tell him about the boot. I didn't tell him about the tarp. I just asked how far the nearest town was. He pointed down the road. I started walking. I haven't been back since. I'd been hiking alone for a week, the air thin and crisp as I trekked through the winding paths of the wilderness. My goal was simple: spend a few days lost in the quiet, away from the chaos of everyday life. I didn't mind the isolation. The only thing that bothered me was the constant reminder that the deeper you went into the forest, the less likely anyone would find you if something went wrong. But I liked it that way. The trail I was on wasn't part of any popular hiking circuit. It wasn't even really a trail in most places, just the remnants of an old logging path that hadn't been used in years. I knew the risks, but I felt confident I could handle it. The only thing I needed was a map, my backpack with essentials: water, food, a sleeping bag, a tent, and a sense of adventure. The quiet was better than any luxury I could imagine. The first day was easy, and by the time I set up camp in a small clearing, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees. I had a view of the valley below, the mountains towering in the distance, their peaks dusted with snow. Everything was peaceful. There were no signs of other hikers, no chatter, no civilization. Just me, the wilderness, and the sounds of the forest. I started a small fire, though it wasn't really necessary in the mild temperature. The crackling wood was a comfort. I ate some trail mix, drank water, and watched as the shadows grew longer. By the time the fire was reduced to a small glowing heap of embers, the sky was dark, and a strange sense of unease settled over me. It wasn't the kind of feeling that would keep you awake, but just enough to make you aware of every noise. The snap of a twig in the distance, the occasional rustle of wind through the leaves. It didn't help that I was alone. When you're on your own in the woods, the sounds can start to play tricks on you. Every snap of a branch could be an animal, or it could be something else. I'd read somewhere that the woods could make people paranoid. Some of it, they said, was just being away from everything, and some of it was the natural soundscape of forests. Things like wind and the creaking of trees that your mind misinterprets when you're isolated. I didn't know what it was, but by the time I zipped myself into my tent, the quiet felt oppressive. The night was long, and I didn't sleep much. At some point, I woke to a noise outside my tent, a scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. My heart skipped a beat. I held my breath, straining to listen. The noise came again, followed by a soft thud, like something had dropped onto the forest floor. I unzipped my tent just a crack and shone my flashlight around. Nothing. There was no sign of any animal. No movement. I hesitated, then let the flap fall back into place and tried to calm my racing thoughts. My mind played tricks in the dark, and I knew it. When morning came, I was still unsettled, but I forced myself to get up. The sounds of the night felt distant now, like they had never happened. The forest was silent again. Maybe the scraping had been an animal. Maybe I had imagined it. The second day of hiking was more challenging. The trail disappeared completely in some areas, leaving me to navigate by memory and the map. The forest was dense, thick with trees and the undergrowth that seemed to grab at your boots with every step. I had to crawl through some sections where the branches had grown over the path. The air was damp, and my breath came in puffs, visible against the chill. Around midday, I came across something strange. An old, rusted metal sign half buried in the dirt. I knelt down to inspect it. The sign was barely legible, but it looked like it had once been a trail marker. It was completely covered in moss and rust, like it had been here for decades. I tried to ignore it, but something about it unsettled me. No one had been out here in years, I thought. Yet there were signs, old trail markers, abandoned campsites, and now this sign, left in the middle of nowhere. Felt like a forgotten trail, but it wasn't entirely forgotten. I stood up and shook off the feeling. The trail was getting steeper, and I needed to focus. The afternoon sun was beginning to slip behind the trees, and I had a lot of ground to cover. The thought of another night alone in the woods was starting to press on my mind. By the time the sun was setting, I found a clearing near a stream to set up camp. It was a beautiful spot, the water flowing softly over smooth stones, a peaceful place to end the day. I set up my tent quickly, lit a fire, and settled in with a small meal. But again, that uneasy feeling started creeping back. The forest was quiet, but there was something wrong about the silence. The creek gurgled in the background, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. The shadows seemed deeper than before, the air heavier. Every rustle of leaves, every distant snap of a branch, set my heart racing. I got into my tent early that night. The fire was dying down, and I zipped myself inside. The thin walls of the tent felt almost too thin. The wind picked up outside, whistling through the trees. But it wasn't the wind that made me freeze. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or something else, moving through the underbrush. But the footsteps were too deliberate. They didn't sound like the random, shifting motion of a wild animal. They were slow, almost as if someone was walking in circles around my camp. I tried to ignore it, but my heart was pounding. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of movement. The footsteps continued, closer now. My throat felt tight. Was it a person? A hiker like me? Lost or searching for water? Or something else? I gripped my flashlight and waited, my breath shallow. The footsteps came again, closer now, just outside my tent. Then the scraping sound returned, the same one I had heard the night before. It was louder this time, like something or someone was dragging a heavy object across the ground. My pulse was thundering in my ears. I held perfectly still. I didn't dare move or make a sound. The scraping stopped. Then came the sound of something heavy being dropped onto the ground with a thud, just outside the tent. I could feel my whole body go cold. I stayed perfectly still, my eyes wide open in the dark. What was it? The sound stopped. The night grew eerily silent. I didn't dare go out to check. I stayed inside, wrapped in my sleeping bag, listening to the night, my mind running wild with thoughts of what could be out there. Eventually, I fell into an uneasy sleep, too exhausted to stay awake any longer. The next morning, I was too afraid to leave my tent at first. I could see nothing unusual outside, but the entire day felt off. The campfire from the night before had been completely extinguished. The wind blew leaves across the ground, but nothing else moved. It was as though the entire forest had gone still, as though something or someone had taken control of the place. I packed up my camp quickly and left, my heart still pounding. As I walked through the woods, the unease never left me. There were no other signs of life, no animals, no other hikers, but something about the place had changed. The woods didn't feel empty. They felt haunted, as if every tree, every rock, every leaf was part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to understand. I kept walking, the sound of my boots on the ground the only noise I could focus on. The trail stretched before me, dark and winding, but I didn't want to turn back. I needed to get out. I finally reached the main trail and saw the first sign of civilization, a worn-out sign marking the end of the forest. I was exhausted, but I couldn't stop walking. I didn't look back. The woods were behind me now, but I knew I wouldn't forget what I had felt there. I haven't gone back since, and I don't think I ever will. Something about that place isn't right. Something about the woods stays with you, even after you leave. I had planned the trip for months, a solo hike through the Cascade Mountains, deep into the wilderness, miles away from any sign of civilization. The route I mapped out would take me through thick forests, across ridges, and down into valleys few people ever saw. It was exactly what I wanted. Complete solitude, surrounded by nature, nothing but my own strength and skill to keep me going. I packed everything carefully. My backpack was heavy with food, water, gear, and emergency supplies. My boots were broken in, my layers planned for the unpredictable mountain weather. I even had a satellite beacon in case something went seriously wrong. I had done solo trips before, but nothing this remote, nothing this demanding. This was the real test. The first day was perfect. The trail was steep, but my legs were fresh, and the air smelled like pine and damp earth. The sun broke through the trees in golden beams, lighting up the moss-covered ground. I followed the trail up into the hills, climbing higher, leaving behind the last signs of human activity. By midday, I had reached the ridgeline, a narrow path cutting along the mountain with steep drop-offs on either side. The view stretched for miles, endless forested slopes rolling toward the horizon, untouched, wild. That night, I set up camp by a small alpine lake. The water was so clear I could see the smooth stones at the bottom. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of wind through the trees and the distant call of an owl. I ate, stretched out in my sleeping bag, and felt completely at peace. The second day, I pushed deeper. The trail became rougher, barely more than an old game path in some places. I had to watch my footing constantly, stepping over exposed roots, loose rocks, patches of mud. I kept moving, pacing myself, drinking water, eating small handfuls of nuts and dried fruit to keep my energy up. I crossed a narrow stream around midday and decided to refill my water bottles. As I crouched by the bank, filtering the cold, clear water, I noticed something strange, a footprint in the mud. It was fresh, the edges still crisp. Not an animal print. A human boot. That didn't make sense. I had followed a rarely used route, far from any maintained trails. The last sign of people I had seen was miles back. Maybe someone had passed through before me, but the print looked too fresh, made within the last few hours. I scanned the area. Nothing. Just trees and undergrowth, silent and undisturbed. No sounds of movement, no other tracks nearby. I kept going. Maybe another hiker had the same idea as me, taking this off-trail route. It was strange, but not impossible. I hiked for hours, climbing over fallen logs, pushing through dense brush, my legs burning with effort. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow valley with steep rock walls on either side. The air was cooler here, the sun already disappearing behind the cliffs. The map showed a faint trail cutting through, leading up the other side toward another ridge. I followed it, moving carefully over loose scree and sharp rocks. Then I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A backpack, torn open, lying against the base of the cliff. It was old, sun-bleached, the fabric shredded as if animals had gotten to it. But it hadn't been there long. There was no moss, no dirt buildup. It looked like it had been abandoned months ago, maybe a year at most. I nudged it with my boot. Empty. No supplies, no ID, nothing to say who it belonged to. My mind raced. Had someone gotten hurt here? Had they fallen? I scanned the cliffside, but there was no sign of bones, no remnants of clothing caught on the rocks. I checked my map again. I was miles from any known campsite. This place wasn't on any official trails. The light was fading fast. I needed to find a place to camp before dark. I hiked another mile up the valley and found a flat spot beneath a rocky overhang. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in my gut. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, heart pounding, convinced I had heard something outside the tent. Every sound, the wind shifting through the trees, the rustle of leaves, felt wrong, too close, too deliberate. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps, slow, careful, stopping just beyond the thin fabric wall. I held my breath. Nothing. I waited, listening, my muscles tensed. Still nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination, the isolation getting to me, but I kept my knife close, gripping it tight until my fingers ached. By dawn, I was already packed and moving. I didn't want to stay there any longer than I had to. The trail climbed sharply, taking me up and out of the valley. My legs burned, my pack felt heavier than before. The silence pressed down on me.
No birds, no insects.
Just the sound of my own breathing, my own footsteps crunching over dirt and stone. Then I saw it. Another footprint, fresh, and this time it wasn't mine. I stared at it, my skin prickling. Someone else was out here, someone moving in the same direction as me. I kept hiking, faster now, pushing myself. I wanted to be out of this area, back on a real trail, anywhere but here. My lungs burned, my pulse hammered in my ears. Then, ahead on the trail, something moved, a shape half hidden by the trees. Tall, human. I froze. The figure stood there, just beyond the edge of the trail, watching. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then it stepped back, vanishing into the trees. I ran. I didn't think, didn't look back. I ran until my legs nearly gave out, until I reached the next ridgeline, where the terrain was too open for anyone to follow me unseen. I kept going, pushing through exhaustion, fear, everything screaming at me to get out. By nightfall, I found a spot far from the trail, hidden between boulders. I barely slept, my knife in my hand, every nerve on edge. The next morning, I moved fast. I hiked for hours, barely stopping, drinking water as I walked, ignoring the pain in my feet. By late afternoon, I reached a marked trail, a real official trail. I had never felt so relieved. I followed it all the way down, my heart pounding with every step. When I finally saw the parking lot, my car sitting exactly where I left it, I almost collapsed. I never found out who was out there. No missing persons reports, no news of lost hikers. Nothing. Just footprints in the dirt. And the feeling that, somewhere in those mountains, someone was still watching.